Timaru, Waimeri and Waiteki in the room. This is on Friday morning. We had a meeting with Martin Jenkins. They've modelled the four councils' numbers. So Alex Assi of Waiteki was there, myself, Karen, Acting Mayor, Ange CE of Mackenzie, and Craig Rowley. And so we were presented the numbers. We also discussed with them what the numbers would look like in and around this joint group. So the 5 councils and also up to that sort of 7 council grouping, if you like. And so we've still got money within our Martin Jenkins budget. And the reason why we decided to do sort of both is we're going to grab the numbers from the other councils, feed that into our model because the assumptions are all the same. But at the same time, we're going to put our numbers into the Morrison Low modelling, just so we've got sort of consistency on where we started and where the southern ones started as well. We haven't, I know all of the elected members haven't seen those numbers yet, but I don't think, there again, I don't think it's necessarily about seeing everything at the moment. This afternoon's paper is more around next steps and keeping doors open so we can go through some further detail. But do you have anything to add on that?
Presentation from Andrew and Stu from...
Oh, they've got one.
Yeah,
oh, yeah, perfect. Oh, cool. Okay.
So Andrew and Stu from Morrison are going to do a presentation of exactly where we're at. We have got some numbers, as dirty as they are, to start off with. So, yeah.
And that's with a 5?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Perfect. We'll pass over to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, we've been the Coalition of the Willing. We've described it variously, various names. Really looking at this being one of the key options that we do consult with our community on, and when it was what started out as all of Otago and Southland became the 4 councils. It's definitely showing some promise around the savings and some of the other benefits of the CCO, so we're keen to progress that. Waitaki was also part of that South Canterbury group as well, so there was also the opportunity for us to be looking north. And I think for us the best is to have as many ones joining together. If it's going to work for some joining together, generally it's going to work for all. There's always the big challenge of harmonisation, and obviously go into a bit of detail on that this afternoon. And none of us wanting to have our ratepayers worse off going into this. So it's really looking at how we make sure that they're not, how we actually level up the standard of our infrastructure between councils, and how we make sure that we do look after every council as well as possible. The other part, I think, is we're all rural councils with urban centres and urban areas, so a lot of rural schemes, and a real differentiation between how they're generally operated and the needs for them, not primarily being around people but more around stock. So looking at how we may differentiate those, I think that's important for quite a number of the councils as well as they go through this process. But it's probably more than enough from me. I think we've got the other 3 councils of the Coalition of the Willing, and we'd be very happy for Timaru to join us, and Mackenzie and they chose to. We did have a Zoom last night, and Mackenzie is looking to bring forward a workshop like this to, rather than 2 weeks away, to have it next week, and see whether they do become part of the CCO group as well. But anyway, that's about it at the moment. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Green means go. From a point of view of the group, so really are assembled in January time. So it's quite an accelerated time frame to bring a group together, a project team, and start fleshing out just what a joint CCO would look like. In terms of, we've adopted the project governance structure that's in the DIA supplied commitment agreement. So I'm not sure if you're aware of that document, but it basically sets out if you're going to get a group of councils together to work together, here's a pre-potted agreement template. So that's the document that is in front of council for decision this afternoon. So we've got all our governance forums in place in terms of project working groups, steering committees, and the council executive group with the mayors on it, going up into the 4 councils' decision-making forums. So just in terms of where we're at, we've framed up the project in terms of put a budget around it. We've got, in terms of a team, we've got Wynne Williams, legal support, Morrison Lowe doing the financial modelling. We've got a change in comms person because a big part of this exercise is just communicating the reality that we're all in and getting that message out. In terms of so commitment agreements signed up by the 4 councils that's been delegated to the Chief Executive, so that agreement is now with them for signature, so we'll press the button on that. And we're in the throes of options analysis, the pros and cons analysis to present to councils in March time as to for them to select their preferred delivery model. So we've got the three options on the table: leave it in-house, set up a standalone CCO, or set up the joint CCO. So we're very much trying to centralise all that analysis and federate that out through the 4 councils. So use the existing comms channels within councils, but standardise the work that we do so that it can be compared on an apples and apples basis, because everyone's plans have got different assumptions baked into them. Some are wastewater disposal to land, some are disposal to water. So we're trying to normalise all of that out and be able to present a view of, if you bring all the councils together, this is what the collated view looks like. So Vaughan Crowther from Utility NZ, so literally just this morning, delivered his draft report on that. And that's a key piece of information which Morrison Lowe will bake into their financial modelling. So we expect that the pros and cons view will be available in the next week, and we'll start crafting the council paper and decision paper around that. And just in terms of overarching time frame, with working back from 3 September, we've only got, I think, 3 or 4 weeks contingency in the overarching plan with that end date in mind. So we're doing the options analysis February and March, looking to secure preferred option decisions from the councils by end of March, and then do our community consultation end April to end May. So that ties in, so existing council have got annual and LTP consultations going on at the moment, so let that complete, and then we go out there with our local water done well consultation exercise. And then, hearings, deliberations in June. Bill 3 should be enacted in June, mid part of this year. Council decision making and approval of if we stick to this path and the community feedback is incorporated, and we end up with, it's a joint CCO is the model that we want to go with, preparing the water services delivery plan through June and July for approvals, and submit that in August, just ahead of the 3 September date. So that's where we're at. And if other councils, very mindful of the fact that we can bring new members in, but we've also got to protect the members who are there, our ability to frame up a joint CCO and complete a plan by that date. If we have someone knocking on the door 6 weeks before 3 September, we can't invalidate all that work, the consultation, the modelling, all of that. So it would have to be, that's where I guess we've got the option to have an implementation plan that foreshadows other councils joining post-implementation. That's probably more of a DIA question. Yeah. So I guess that's the overarching context of where we're at. We've got a good group of mayors and a good group of buttering them up, but a good a cohesive group of mayors and chief executives. So we've got a great, good working environment. So that makes all our lives a lot easier. Yeah, just looking to continue that. So if we can bring in further members and keep that momentum, then that's a win for everyone. I'll pause, take any questions, and then the meat of the exercise is Stu talking us through the quick and dirty financial modelling that's been done for the prospective group of 5. Anything off the back of that?
Yeah, look, totally open to this because we've got to do something to change, I agree. Just in your time frame though, you kind of ran through as though we'll accept that and our ratepayers will accept the idea. If we were to step out of this group, when's kind of the final date we could do that?
Yeah. So we've agonised over this. It is very much a trust model in that we know that anyone can leave right up until the point at which the Water Services Delivery Plan is submitted. Once it's submitted, that's a DIA question because you're now backing out of a commitment that you made. So we know that we can bring a group together and all march in step, but something could happen that would trip one up. And that's where we've just got to rely on the trust and willingness of the group, and we can't see any way around that. Otherwise, it would be too difficult to step into a commitment agreement that doesn't allow you to step out. So there are step-out clauses there, and you just accept the costs incurred up to that point. But yeah, it's a trust model.
Pretty more a question for DIA. I would have been of the view that DIA would have been comfortable to keep it pretty open for understanding timelines, etc., but for others to join, because ultimately that appears to be the push from the government around, more is merrier. Is there flex as far as you're concerned? Because look, I think this, group is a logical choice, but also, Mackenzie's considering Waimate. I'm aware of, smaller councils such as Kaikoura and Huranui who, yes, have a shared service or looking around a shared service with Waimak, but actually aren't that happy probably around it. So, how do you guys help support? Because I would have thought, if we can get a larger grouping, that's probably of benefit.
We'll help wherever we can, however we can. I think there's, to some extent, the key is that the solution really is about local waters done well. So to some extent, it's really down to the group for you to decide how comfortable you are for somebody to come in later on and under what conditions you would allow that to come in. The view we've got is that, when you look at it, there is economy and scale with the things we're seeing coming through the pipeline. Right? Pardon the pun there. We're seeing a significant wall of capital work to be done in the next 10 years. Right? The last time we saw the sort of per annum spends that we've seen now, we did see them quite recently. The government's shovel-ready projects put the contracting industry in New Zealand under a huge amount of pressure. You probably had certain issues yourself. In the NTU, we had a number of requests coming through to us from councils saying we were budgeting 20 million for this. With where the contracting industry is now, it's going to cost us 40 million. So a collective buying power is going to be important to that in terms of the prioritisation. Right? What we're seeing in the LTPs is at least a doubling of the capital spend to what was done in the last LTP. So that's going to be quite important in terms of how that's going to happen. The other thing we're seeing through the mix is councils are at different stages in terms of do they have a burning platform. Right? So some are sitting back saying, we're not really on a burning platform, we'll just wait and see what happens. A lot of them are actually saying, we realise at some point we're going to go into a multi-council CCO. We'll just wait and see how it pans out though. So really, we would prefer more in, but it's really up to you as shareholders as to what conditions you would have to them coming in. Yep.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we can segue to Stu Cross, Morrison Low. Yep, Stu, over to you.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you everyone for inviting me to have a chat and to present this stuff. I'm going to try and share my screen. It'd be Andrew, if you can, just because you're the face that I can see and I can recognise, you can just tell me when the PowerPoint is up and looking all right. Yep, I can see a thumbs up there. Awesome. Okay. Hey, so thank you very much everyone for finding some time for me to come in and discuss this. I've got what I'm going to present today is I think Andrew's referred to it as the quick and dirty modelling, and I think that's probably the informal name for this, but it is very quick and very dirty. This has been undertaken in the space of a couple of days with very little interrogation of any of Timaru's data in particular. So before I get into it, I'm going to throw out the standard consultant cover my butt kind of clauses and notes here, just because it's really important when we're looking at numbers that we don't get too fixated on those numbers. And I think what's really important as well is that, you know, and I've already heard it from some of the discussions and questions that have been raised this morning, is that the numbers are just one part of it. I don't like actually often presenting numbers before we get through all the non-financial stuff, because as soon as a number's got thrown out there, people get fixated on that number and then it becomes the only truth. But that said, we also recognise that the numbers are what people want to see often, so hence why we are kind of presenting this initial high level stuff. So the quick assumptions and caveats here: we haven't done any review of your financial data or asset management inputs. We've just taken them and stuck them in the model to be able to produce some outcomes here. There has been some review of the Otago Southland Group's work though, because we've been doing work for that Otago Southland Group for quite some time, while the small group's only been kind of working together in earnest and at pace since kind of January. That is an offshoot of work that was done, it started maybe in June last year. So there's been a whole pile of work that's gone under the bridge already for them. But there are still areas that further refinements needed in both the Timaru data and in the rest of the group of four. And Andrew's touched on some of that work that we've had Vaughan do and Utility NZ do as well. So there's just a few big caveats here, and I guess one of the big ones for me as well is the sensitivity testing that we'll need to do around this, because we've got a lot of uncertainty around what capital programs actually look like beyond about year 4, and Dave Foster helpfully used a stat there that capital programs have doubled in the last LTP. I'm pretty sure if you looked at the one before that, they probably doubled again. So, you know, we know that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of capital programs beyond the 3 or 4 years in here as well, and we want to make sure that we can express that in the future modelling that we produce. So our modelling approach is based on your LTPs and your infrastructure strategies. There are some additional costs added here to comply with economic regulation, but we haven't added at this point the Commerce Commission levies or Taumata Arawa levies. They'll be the same dollar amount per connection for anyone under any model, so they don't form part of the consideration in our view around what delivery model you might kind of adopt anyhow. We've also added some additional costs for establishment of a CCO and corporate overheads for a CCO. Look, again, further detailed work needs to happen at some point to be able to get them down to a really perfect number, but we've made an estimate of that, so there are some additional costs included in there. The big one, I guess, for our modelling approach, and it's useful for you to understand, is the difference in debt management, and that's really the difference between, well, that's really the underpinning assumption with local water done wells models anyhow. So we've assumed that council can borrow at a parent level, even when it continues to have 3 waters. So when we present some numbers around what your status quo might look like, we have assumed you can borrow up to 280%. In terms of setting your revenue requirements, though, we're working to a 250% limit, and that's because most councils don't actually, their lending covenants within their own LTPs and their restrictions on borrowing are usually much lower than the 280% and usually around 250 to provide some borrowing headroom. And we've assumed an entity can borrow to a 8% free funds from operations to debt ratio. That is a little bit of a different metric. I don't know if you've been introduced to that before, but really for these entities, when we're talking about free funds from operations, we're talking about the operating cash flow. And it's operating cash flow to debt being 8% or better. So that's, we're used to working to a debt to revenue ratio. We were trying to stay under it. Here we're trying to stay above 8%. And we've assumed that an entity will work to that ratio. And when I say we've assumed that it will work to that ratio, what I mean is that we've assumed that it will always ensure that its debt is at that level. So it's trying to find the optimum balance between debt and revenue. But this is all kind of just to say that our modelling approach is really driven by debt. And because it's driven by debt, it's also driven by the capital works programs that we've got in here. So OPEX assumptions, if we've got them wrong, probably aren't going to change the dial too much in terms of this. Our CapEx programs, if they're off by an order of magnitude, it is going to change the price paths for either individual councils or the entity. So just before I pull up some numbers, so there is some further work required to present a view of water service delivery models and their relative strengths and weaknesses. So in particular, this is the work that we've identified as a group that we need to do, and some of this is underway. One is the external review of asset management plans and LTP budgets to make sure that we're comparing apples with apples and that we've got our costing assumptions all lined up. The next one is an assessment of the potential impact of new wastewater standards for each council. So wastewater is a significant component of a lot of the capital programs that we've got. New wastewater standards were released in a government cabinet paper or a discussion document on the 25th of February. And so we've gone through the process of reviewing that and looking at each council's of the group of four, their asset management plans and identifying what the impact of that is. That's not reflected in the modelling yet. I only just got the results of that this morning. We're also going through some joint CCO design and modelling, including consideration of regional versus local pricing. We've had some workshops on that where we've discussed some of the principles that we think are really important around the CCO and the design element, but they need to be worked through a little bit more in a little bit more detail. And then finally, we probably also want to get DIA and or Taumata ROI to review some of the modelling and the option analysis as well to provide a level of robustness to this. So that's all my caveats and disclaimers all out of the way before I present some information. And I'm going to start off just showing you our modelling, at least of your current debt to revenue and your current borrowing headroom. And you'll see I've put a pretty in-your-face statement at the top there saying that you're currently debt constrained. I'm showing here that dark blue area at the top of the chart is the amount of borrowing headroom you have just between the 250 and 280%. So that's the area that often councils don't like to dip into. The light green area below is the borrowing capacity that you have up to the 250% debt to revenue ratio. So you'll see for a number of years, from about 2026 through to 2030, Timaru effectively has no borrowing headroom at that 250% kind of debt to revenue ratio that we have there. The dark green is your Three Waters debt component, and you can see at the moment it probably makes up about 40% of your total debt, and that's increasing over time. But you can see that the share of your debt that relates to Three Waters over time is going to increase and increase. Although we haven't made any assumptions about you borrowing any extra money outside of Three Waters beyond 2034, hence the flat line for that grey area. What I'd note here is, just like capital works programs, when we look at council LTPs and borrowing requirements, we often see the same kind of curve that you've got there with the top of that dark green area, right? So we've got debt going up for the first 3-4 years, and then it flattens off and maybe starts coming down. Now, if I layer on the next LTP, we often see the same thing happen again, but now it's on the area that's flattening out. So we often don't actually see these debt projections, particularly where you're projecting that your debt's going to reduce. We often don't see that debt reduction actually happens in time. So what this tells me is that Timaru District Council, under its current projections, will not be able to invest in anything else other than Three Waters infrastructure, or projects that are identified in its LTP over the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be very difficult to make those investments. And I'm quite happy to be challenged on that, but that's from our first look at that data. And like I say, I haven't interrogated that data in any great detail at this point. Moving on to the pricing of the regional entity, and I wanted to show this first. It's a very messy graph, and it's very hard to see what's going
Hold
on.
on,
This is
hold
just
on.
showing.
Sorry, just before you go on, we'll just make a comment. Nigel, go.
That debt graph doesn't look right to us, so
Right. Okay.
we're not punching up that high in terms of that dark green, so we'll just review that. There is
Yep.
quite a bit of capacity there. So we'll
Okay.
have a look at that and see where those numbers came from. Do you have a comment, Andrea?
I guess in the LTP, we were looking to push it 2.35% at topping out at 409 million.
Right, we're still at it sort of around the 409. A little bit higher than that.
2029, so.
Yeah.
That's
And-
probably a
and-
good chance to point out as well. Sorry, Stu, Ben Bell here, Mayor of Gore. That spike in year 2035 is two of our wastewater treatment plants, which with
not
the
in
new
this one, sorry,
standards. Was it sorry?
Not in this one, Ben.
Oh no, okay, no,
Yep.
my bad.
Sorry. Sorry, this is just Timaru's debt, so it won't have your spike in it yet. But yes, there is a big spike from Gore in around that time in terms of your wastewater treatment plants coming through at an entity level. Sorry, I thought I'd better jump in there quickly. Okay, so your debt profile may not be quite as ugly as that, but and so the burning platform may not be as burning as I may have picked up from my review of that data. So just looking at this chart, I appreciate that no one's going to be able to read this in much detail on a screen at the end of a room, but I think the key point here is this is every council's line if we stick to localised pricing under a regional CCO model. And what we can see here is that the key thing to take away from here is that every solid line is underneath its respective dotted line, right? So the respective dotted line is if the council carried on its own. The solid line is what its price path would be were it to join this regional entity. So there is there appears to be a path where everyone is able to pay less under a Three Waters service delivery model here. And I've presented the data only out to 2034. We've modelled out to 54, but I caution reading anything into data with capital works programs that extend beyond that period. So hence why I've cut this off for the moment in what I'm presenting. You're more interested in your own council though, so I have also just presented here what it looks like just from a Timaru perspective. So what we can see here is for the first few years, we're assuming that the entity is going to start on the 1st of July 2027. And that's a point that we've discussed at workshops and decided is a realistic time frame to be able to ensure that we set this thing up properly. So for the first couple of years there, we've got your what we've called average household charge. It might be different to your per connection charge that you might have seen in other modelling. We try and look at only household the rates that are collected from households and only the household connections. And again, a little bit more work needs to be done in there to refine some of that data. So we have you following that same path for the first 3 years there. And then we've got that light green line at the bottom as the local pricing line. So that's the equivalent of that blue line at the bottom of the previous chart. And we've got that carrying on at a lower amount than what we've modelled your in-house business unit as requiring over that same time period. And then at the top, that dark blue line, that is the price if we move to a regional average price in the water entity, effectively on day one or at the point in time at which you're looking at that line. So if we move to a regional price on day one, we're not going to mince words around here. clearly Timaru ratepayers would likely pay more if we moved straight to a regional average price across that whole modelling period. But what we would see is that if we manage to maintain local pricing, which I think is still something that we're considering as a group, and we still have to do some work on in terms of how we frame that up and how long we consider maintain local pricing and what conditions we might have where we move to an average price, that Timaru ratepayers would be significantly better off than they would be under a stay-alone in-house business unit. Just to demonstrate some of the combined capital program that we've modelled here, and again, I've kept the snapshot to 10 years. We do have data going a bit further out. You can see that we end up with a bit of a lumpy program or a bit of a higher program near the end of the modelling periods in 32 right to 34. And you can also see the impact of our efficiencies there. The line on the graph is the entity's combined program, and the other stacked areas are obviously each council's individual programs. Where we've got that line sitting above the combined programs there, that's effectively just where we're capitalising some of the establishment cost of the entity. That doesn't really move the price path a lot. You see that it looks like quite a big gap there of about 18 million in 1 year, and then it reducing a little bit over the following year. That is really it, just spending some money on establishing the entity, and a big chunk of that cost is on an enterprise, an ERP system for the entity. That wouldn't have to happen at the start when the entity is established, but it would probably need to happen over time, particularly given the size of the amalgamation here when we're bringing 5 councils together on different systems. It's likely that it would need to invest in that at some point. The next chart here, I think that the problems I'm having are only on my screen, hopefully. The next chart here is the total CCO debt versus the business unit, and you can see again the combined profiles adding up there, and we actually have the combined debt of the group a little bit higher than the for an entity than it is at a combined. Talking about where it's trying to find the optimal balance between revenue and debt so that it's actually trying to keep charges as low as it can by effectively utilising its borrowing differently to fund its capital program, and particularly its renewals program. Going out 30 years, and the reason I present this is predominantly to show you that we're not trying to hide price increases by using a whole pile of debt. There is a price increase coming through. That's largely driven by, like being indicated, some big capital programs that are happening there rather than the need to repay debt. So we've got things like Gores wastewater treatment projects that are in there. We've got a few of Clofer's treatment projects in there. I think there might even be some Central Otago wastewater treatment projects also in that that later half of the modelling period. And you'll see I've kind of just blurred that a little bit because this area here is highly uncertain in terms of what that price path is, and that's why I haven't tried to show you what each individual council looks like sitting against that price path in this modelling. When we do want to present that is when we can start layering on that uncertainty as well, so that you can see that actually there is a huge amount of uncertainty over this period, and that hopefully what we'll be able to demonstrate is that the entity kind of sits neatly in the middle of all that uncertainty. That is all the content that I have to share today. My last slide here is just one asking for questions, so I'm quite happy to take questions on that. I'm conscious also that we don't have a ton of time, and I don't know if anyone else from the group is also wanting to speak to you today, so I don't want to monopolise all of their time if that's what they're wanting to do. I will stop sharing my screen now though.
Hi, it's Stu from the Timaru Council. Slide 8, where you talk about harmonisation.
Yeah.
I guess the key for me going into this entity was efficiencies. The harmonisation appears to show we'll pay more than if we stand alone. So can you tell me what harmonisation means? Or
So when we're talking about harmonisation, we're using that term in terms of the entity charging a single regional price across everyone. So if it were to do that, and I'm not saying it will do that, but we're wanting to present the information so that people know what it looks like, I think, and trying to be intellectually honest here. if it were to jump towards a regional price, absolutely you would pay more than you would otherwise, and that's largely because you sit below the line otherwise, right? Now, there is no requirement for an entity to adopt a regional price. There is no decision that has been made by the group of four about whether we adopt a regional price and at what time we adopt a regional price. I believe that the way that we would deal with this most likely is that we would have a principle for the entity to set its prices in such a way that no one pays more than they otherwise would for the level of investment that they are receiving in their community. And then the entity would, over time, potentially work towards a regional price, but it would only do so when those conditions were met.
It's Nigel here from Timaru District Council. At some point, is the four going to do analysis to try and understand why there is such a variation in cost to the consumer? Because that range looks quite wide.
Yep.
When the work we did for the four here, the range was a lot narrower. We were all closer to harmonised than this range shows. So it'd be interesting to understand at some point why the differences.
Yeah, and so that range, and you're referring, I assume, to, if I pull it up, the chart on page 7, maybe, where we have quite a big range there in terms of the different prices. And really that's about the fact that councils are coming in with different levels of debt, and they're coming in with very different capital works programs. And let's be honest, the councils that we're dealing with here, the populations that are being served are not huge.
I think,
and I think that's predominantly what we're dealing with there.
yeah, Councillor Booth, I mean, if you look at slide 7, it clearly shows savings for everyone. And you know, that price harmonisation is part of the negotiation that would be worked out after you'd agreed to be part of the working group to work towards an agreement. It's like we'd perhaps, you know, isolate our debt. Those are the things, etc., that we would talk about and form the agreement around. So, but they're clearly showing that there's benefits in going with consolidating. Even if you go back to slide 8, you know, and we stuck with our own charges here. There's advantages. So, and I think you guys sort of, you know, perhaps you could work towards price harmonisation down the line once you've got things underway, but that would be obviously detrimental to our ratepayer just right now. Just looking at that.
Absolutely, and I think that's what we're trying to show here. I think, or at least what I'm trying to show here, is that there is a scenario where everyone joins this entity and everyone's ratepayers are better off. The question is, I guess, for how long? And this is where we have to work through those principles around. So at what point does an entity consider harmonisation? Is that a time-based thing or is that a condition-based thing? And I think if it was a condition-based thing, that might be more palatable, but we can work through that. I think it's still an area that there's probably negotiation room. And certainly I don't think we've firmed up exactly what that detail looks like at this point.
But on the debt there, you mentioned 2.8 times. I thought we were allowed to go 5.
Yeah, okay. And so 2.8 is at the whole total council level. And that is a covenant that's enforced by the local government funding agency. We don't see that covenant's likely to change unless you're a high growth council and are able to negotiate the new 3.5 ratios. But within water services, the new CCOs, a lot of, and this is probably where the government has indicated that the new CCOs will be able to lend up to 5 times revenue. That actually translates to this 8% FFO ratio. So that's what we've modelled to, which is actually the actual covenant that is more likely to be used by LGFA. But it's broadly equivalent to a 5 times debt to revenue ratio for water.
Stu Piddington back again. Sorry, just a couple of questions. Do those numbers include the cost of setting up a CCO, and What sort of number
Yes.
did you put in for that?
Yes, it does, and I can give you the budget once I can actually open it up in my model. But it includes many of the costs for that. So we've included almost there. It includes the costs of the transition team, new entity setup, business process work, comms and engagement, rebrands, restructuring costs, finance and funding costs, legal and compliance costs, and an ERP and some office fit out. And in total, spread over 2 years, effectively, we've got that at 20 million, which is pretty significant. Most of that, 14 million of that, relates to an ERP. So we've factored in a very generous budget, and we like to factor in what we consider to be a generous budget because we don't want to be accused of gold plating it.
I can't help but ask, what are the consultant costs in that 20 million?
So it would probably depend where you expect those consultant costs to sit. So that would probably be in the finance, funding, comms and engagement, business process, legal. There is probably about 1.5 million in there would be my gut feeling, but we haven't really worked it out in terms of breaking it down between consultants and staff costs, and certainly we haven't tried to determine where those would sit in terms of resources exactly. So a big chunk of the actual cost is in setting up transition leads, transition workstream managers for various different areas. We would imagine they'd be contractors, not consultants.
So this is Nigel here again. I'm a bit fixated on the unit price. So what efficiency assumptions have you got in here?
Yep.
And secondly, I just still struggling with the fact that if I was, on page 7, if I was one of the councils at the higher end, I'd be going, why can't I get down to that light blue one? Because if we're, I don't know what percentage of population for this group would be, probably about 40%. So why couldn't the other 60% get itself down closer to those blue lines? And that's, to me, that's the secret in this, is working out why have we got the differences and what can we do about those differences. And I don't necessarily accept it's all dead. I think there must be something else in there that is actually driving that.
So we have got some efficiencies modelled in here, but we have been very conservative with our efficiency assumptions. So in terms of the level of efficiencies that we have modelled in here, we have currently assumed that this entity would be able to achieve about 1% efficiencies per year, just under 1% efficiencies per year, and we've only modelled that out for the first 10 years. So that's quite conservative. It's lower than inflation. We're not, again, loading this up with big gold-plated efficiencies. We again believe that the efficiencies could be higher than that, but we're also well aware of the resistance that was met by the sector when Labour's affordable water reform was going around, and there were suggestions then of efficiencies of up to 40 or 50%. So we've definitely tried to moderate those efficiencies and come down to a number that we believe is achievable without necessarily being extreme.
Yeah, it's Andrew Dixon here from Timaru. I'm just interested, how did you calculate the number of customers in your calculation when it comes to these pricing? Because stormwater is a land-based rate, so it's across all ratepayers. We have rural water schemes that have individual numbers of customers on them. How do you determine those customers? It seems,
Yeah, I think pretty clear. There's probably more work that needs to be done to get that absolutely perfect right. I think the key things to note on here is, so for rural schemes, what we've assumed is that for the number of properties charged, so we're working on the assumption that rural schemes are charged for a unit of demand. So a rural property that's purchasing 2 units of demand, we've assumed is one residential ratepayer and 1 non-residential ratepayer. So the other units of demand, effectively any unit of demand beyond the first one is for non-household use. In terms of stormwater and wastewater, we have relied on the information from your rating database about what properties are commercial and which ones are not, and the number of charges that you have. So for stormwater, it's the number of stormwater charges that are levied. For wastewater, it's obviously the number of stormwater connection charges that are levied. Ultimately, while it is kind of important to understand what that number is, because we're using that as the same denominator in all of the equations that we're using, it moves those numbers the same way. So if it's different, because it's consistent in the CCO model as well as in the in-house business unit model.
Just note, in the multi-council owned water organisation, that's quite critical. The financing options and credit rating impacts will be dependent on whether shareholding councils choose to provide financial support or not.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean that perhaps some councils may put their assets into the pool but not back them up? Because surely you'd have to do that. Seems like this is on the DIA information sheet I've got in front of me.
I haven't worked on any model where there's an assumption that people will not support the borrowing of the organisation proportionately to what their borrowing requirements are. And I'm not sure that anyone would be working on a model under that assumption, but certainly the guidance would suggest that there's some flexibility there.
Yep, no, sure. Thank you.
Further questions, team? We are on a timeline. We have 8 minutes left. I might throw it over to Brian, Ben or Tamer if you wanted to take the opportunity to have a chat to our team here, and I'll save you go for the cream. That was my approach, to be fair, but but go for it.
Is it okay if I go, Nigel?
Go for it, Brian. Thanks, mate.
Kia ora, team, and look, thanks for the opportunity to come and present to you today. Hey, this has been going on for 6 years. You're probably as drained as we are on it. But what it's come down to, and what I really like about this group, is that the trust is building. We know the figures are there and they're moving around a fair bit. We know there's a lot of them variables to consider, but we're sitting at the table and we're doing the best thing by the ratepayers. Come June or July, there's a big decision to be made, but we're giving it the opportunity, and I wish you well in your deliberations. It's a hard job, but we as a collective are working well together. Nigel's always been good to work in with. The trust is building, the hopes are building, and I'd be really peeved as a leader of Clutha if I didn't turn every stone, if I didn't explore everything. And I don't actually know what's going to be under the rock in July, but I'm going to hang in there and find out, and I couldn't ask to be in with a better group than what we've got at the moment. So all the best, team. Thanks for the chance to talk. Kia ora.
Thanks, Brian. Ben or Tamer?
Sure thing. Kia ora, everybody. Tamer Ali here from Central Otago. I can completely understand the hesitation around some of the numbers. We've had that from our councillors as well, wanting to have a firmer picture on what those look like. And I think the reality is, at this point, getting firm numbers is just an impossibility for us. What we're looking at the moment is the alternative benefits that come out of this. Things like, for a very small council like us, Gore and Clutha, the ability to attract and retain a really quality workforce that have got the skills that we need them to have, the ability to attract and retain a really competent board. We're aware if every council in New Zealand goes it alone, then we'll end up with 67 water service entity boards with the likes of PTA members controlling water services assets, which, although well-meaning, we haven't always had the best outcomes. We're aware that Some of those things are going to trump the numbers for us. We would like to be working with other councils. We genuinely believe that there are some efficiencies that can come from that, and that maybe they can't be measured in this point in time. So we're just hoping that as we progress towards putting together a water service delivery plan, we keep this alive as an option for our community. They'll come back and tell us what they think of it. Some of that will be based on the numbers and some of it won't. But the thing that has been great about working with this group so far, like Brian highlighted, is that we're operating on a high trust model. We all get along well. It's actually been quite a delight to work together, because it is not always like that with our neighbouring councils up and down the country. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Tamer. And Ben, did you want to add anything, mate?
Yeah, I can wrap it up. I think it's been covered pretty well by everyone here today. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come along. I guess it's pretty special, us councils working together. I've made it pretty clear that I'm a bit disappointed by the bigger cities not being interested in sharing some of the load. So it is great that we can all have these open conversations on a high trust model and try and deliver for our ratepayers the best we possibly can. With the change in wastewater standards, I know that my numbers locally are going to change, as they will for numbers all around the country. So really looking at those external benefits that have already been mentioned, economies of scale, purchasing power, and staff retention is really key for us. So thank you very much. I hopefully look forward to working with you all, as it's been a bit tough down my way with my colleagues. So I've really enjoyed working with Otago and hopefully Canterbury as well. So cheers, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, working with Canterbury. Old Gary's got a wee toe in the water in Canterbury. So, Gary, have you got anything to add, mate, before we close up?
No, I think, Timaru's in a similar position to what Waitaki was with the 4 councils. So with the 5 councils, probably we're improving around how close we are to the harmonisation line, but reality is, we're not focused on that. It's like, what's our saving overall by being in an organisation versus being out of it, and that's going to keep us in the discussion, right, like Brian, right through to the end, so that we do go out with this as one of the options. And whether it is our preferred option by that time, we'll find out, but we'll see how we get on. But appreciate the opportunity.
No, thanks, and thanks everyone for making the time. From team up here, did you guys want anything to close, or you're sort of comfortable? I'm sorry, apologies, we've got 2 minutes before our council meeting, but yeah. So, and from DAA, I mean, obviously you want to see councils work together, the harmonisation thing, these conversations are going to be happening across the country, I expect, aren't they, on whether that happens today or at a year into the future. So, yeah, I guess it's some of those efficiencies and I assume what government want to see.
Yeah, I think that's going to emerge over time. It's probably going to be more of a commerce, to be quite honest, than anything. I guess one of the comments I'd make in the mix of it, having been through this, is it's actually a journey. And I think the important thing is not to get rocked by standard pricing, but actually, if it's an issue, understand how you want that to be worked through as a collective. Right? Because Brian made a really interesting point, and it was supported actually by the review that was done of the Auckland Council CCOs and where they were working, where they weren't. And a critical issue with a CCO is effectively the trust that the council has with it. And therefore, this is an organisation, its establishment and its success is going to be determined effectively by the speed of trust. And it needs to be maintained right the way through. So actually understanding that there's an issue there and thinking about how you might deal with that in the future is more important than actually answering that now, because a point that was made, and Stuart referred to it, when you analyse, and I've got tables that analyse every LTP since they first came in, so I can overlay capital spend, operational spends at the activity level from 2012. What we've seen through those is the revenue lines and the expense lines are very predictable. the capital works lines, when you overlay one over the other, they look like a Manhattan skyline, right? And so your big uncertainty is in your capital work program, and Stuart raised very, very rightly, your capital spend program is driving your debt. Your debt is going to drive your revenue settings. So your major uncertainty through this is in the capital work program. And I would suggest that's where you're going to see the major efficiencies coming out of a multi-council CCA. Right.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. We'll close it off there. Thanks for everyone's participation. Thanks for joining us online. Team, thanks, Gary, for coming up. And if you're tuning in online, we'll take a short break and we'll be back for a very exciting council meeting coming to you very soon.